It was supposed to be a quiet night in rural Ohio. A woman's body found in her own kitchen, her best friend nowhere to be found. But when investigators started digging, they uncovered a web of secrets, betrayal, and forbidden love that tore an entire town apart. It began as friendship. It ended in tragedy. And in the middle was a love affair no one saw coming. 3 people connected by trust, compassion, and acceptance. But beneath the surface, emotions were building that none of them could control, emotions that would lead to violence, loss, and a courtroom battle that would divide a community forever. This is a story about love in its most complicated form, about the cost of secrets, and about how quickly everything can fall apart when you cross a line you can never uncross. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This story takes place in a small industrial town in southeastern Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your name, your business, and your mistakes. It's a town built on factory jobs, Friday night football, and Sunday morning church services. The kind of place where tradition runs deep and change comes slow. In the spring of 2019, a woman named Georgia Turner moved into a modest rental house on the east side of town. She was 34 years old, a trans woman who had relocated from Kansas City after losing her job and wanting a fresh start. Georgia was quiet, kept to herself mostly, and worked nights as a bartender at a local dive called the Copper Rail. She had soft brown eyes, a gentle demeanor, and a past full of rejection and pain that she rarely talked about. Most people in town didn't know what to make of her at first. Some were curious, others were cold, but Georgia wasn't looking for trouble. She just wanted to live her life in peace. That's when she met Naomi Wright. Naomi was 28, an elementary school teacher with a warm smile and an open heart. She taught 3rd grade and was known around town for being kind, patient, and fiercely compassionate. Naomi had grown up in the area, married her high school sweetheart Gideon Wright when she was 22, and settled into what seemed like a stable, predictable life. Gideon was 31, a quiet man who worked at a local manufacturing plant. He was the kind of guy who showed up on time, did his job, and went home without much fanfare. People respected him, but he wasn't the type to open up easily. He kept his emotions locked down, his frustrations buried, and his struggles to himself. Naomi and Georgia's friendship began in an unexpected way. One afternoon at the grocery store, Georgia overheard a group of women whispering about her, making cruel jokes loud enough for her to hear. Naomi, who was standing nearby, stepped in without hesitation. She looked those women in the eye and said, "That's enough. She's a person, just like you." Georgia never forgot that moment. It was the first time in a long time someone had stood up for her without expecting anything in return. They exchanged numbers that day, and over the following weeks, a real friendship began to form. Naomi invited Georgia over for dinner. Gideon was polite, if a bit reserved, but as the months went on, the 3 of them started spending more time together. Georgia would come over to help with house projects. Gideon would stop by the bar after work to unwind. Naomi loved having someone to talk to who understood what it was like to feel different, to fight for acceptance in a world that didn't always make space for you. On the surface, it seemed like a beautiful, unlikely friendship. But beneath that surface, something else was beginning to grow. Something none of them were ready to name. By the fall of that year, Georgia had become a fixture in the Wright household. She was there for birthdays, weekend barbecues, and late-night conversations on the back porch. Naomi trusted her completely. And why wouldn't she? Georgia had been nothing but loyal, supportive, and kind, but what Naomi didn't see was the way Gideon had started looking at Georgia when she wasn't paying attention, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the way he lingered a little too long when they were alone. Gideon had been struggling for months. Work had become unbearable. His boss was riding him hard, the hours were long, and the pay wasn't enough to cover the bills. He felt stuck, emasculated, like he was failing as a husband and a man. He stopped talking to Naomi about it because he didn't want to burden her, so he kept it inside, let it fester, let it grow into something heavy and dark. And then there was Georgia. She listened. She didn't judge. She didn't try to fix him or tell him what to do. She just sat with him, shared her own stories of pain and rejection, and made him feel like he wasn't alone. For Gideon, that feeling was intoxicating. It was something he hadn't felt in years. Georgia, on the other hand, was caught in her own emotional storm. She had spent so much of her life being rejected, pushed away, told she didn't belong. And here was this man, this kind, solid, decent man, who saw her, not as a trans woman, not as an outsider, just as Georgia. She knew it was wrong. She knew Naomi was her friend, maybe her only real friend. But the loneliness she had carried for so long was too much to ignore, and Gideon's attention felt like oxygen after years of suffocating. By December, the three of them were still spending time together, but the dynamic had shifted in subtle ways. Gideon started showing up at the bar more often, always alone. He'd sit at the end of the counter, nursing a beer, waiting for George's shift to end. Naomi started noticing that Gideon was distant, distracted, less affectionate. She'd ask him if something was wrong and he'd shrug it off, say he was just tired. But she could feel it, that invisible wall growing between them. One night, after Naomi had gone to bed early, Gideon stayed up watching television. Georgia texted him, just a simple message. "You okay?" He stared at that text for a long time before he replied. "Not really," she wrote back. "Want to talk?" And that's how it started, a conversation that should have stayed between friends, but didn't. They met up the next night after George's shift. Just to talk, they told themselves. They sat in Gideon's truck in the parking lot behind the bar, the engine running to keep warm, the radio playing low. They talked about everything, about feeling trapped, about being misunderstood, about wanting more from life than what they had. And then, at some point, the talking stopped. Gideon reached over and took Georgia's hand. She didn't pull away. They sat there in silence, both of them knowing they had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Over the next 2 months, Gideon and Georgia began seeing each other in secret. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It was messy, emotional, and full of guilt. They met in parking lots, cheap motels on the edge of town, anywhere they wouldn't be seen. Every time they were together, they told themselves it would be the last time, but it never was. Georgia wrote about it in her journal, pages and pages of conflicted thoughts. "I know this is wrong," she wrote one night. "I know I'm hurting someone who showed me kindness when no one else would, but for once in my life someone isn't pretending. Someone sees me and wants me anyway. How do I walk away from that?" Gideon was just as torn. He loved Naomi. He didn't want to hurt her, but he felt alive with Georgia in a way he hadn't felt in years. She didn't need him to be strong or perfect. She just needed him to be real, and that felt like a gift he didn't know he was missing. But in a town where everyone talks, secrets don't stay hidden for long. People started noticing. The bartender at the Copper Rail saw Gideon's truck parked outside too many nights in a row. A co-worker spotted him at a motel 2 towns over. Whispers started spreading through the church parking lots, the grocery store aisles, the break rooms at the plant. Naomi started hearing things, little comments, veiled questions. "Is everything okay with you and Gideon?" one of her friends asked during lunch one day. Naomi brushed it off, said everything was fine. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She just didn't want to believe it. One evening in late February, Naomi came home early from a teacher's meeting. She walked into the kitchen and saw Gideon's phone sitting on the counter, the screen lit up with a text notification. She picked it up without thinking. The message was from Georgia. "I miss you. When can I see you again?" Naomi's hands started shaking. She scrolled up through the conversation, weeks of messages, confessions, plans, words that made her stomach turn. She sat down at the kitchen table and waited. When Gideon came home an hour later, she didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just held up the phone and asked, "How long?" Gideon froze. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Naomi's voice cracked. "How long have you been sleeping with her?" He sat down across from her, his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Naomi stood up, walked to the bedroom, and locked the door. She didn't come out for hours. When she finally did, Gideon was gone. The next morning, word spread fast. Naomi called her sister, who told her mother, who told half the women's group at church. By noon, the entire town seemed to know. And the judgment came swift and brutal. Most of it landed on Georgia. People said she had seduced Gideon, manipulated him, preyed on his kindness. They called her names, said she didn't belong, said she had destroyed a good Christian marriage. Someone spray-painted a slur across the side of her car. The owner of the copper rail pulled her aside and told her it might be best if she found work somewhere else. Georgia was devastated. She tried calling Naomi to apologize, to explain, but Naomi wouldn't answer. She tried texting Gideon, but he had blocked her number. She felt like the world was caving in on her. Meanwhile, Gideon stopped showing up to work. He moved in with a buddy from the plant and avoided going anywhere he might run into Naomi or Georgia. He was ashamed, broken, unsure of how to fix what he had destroyed. Naomi took a leave of absence from teaching. She couldn't face the students, couldn't face the other teachers who all knew what had happened. She spent her days at home, crying, praying, trying to make sense of how her life had fallen apart so quickly. And then, on a cold March evening, everything changed. Naomi sent Georgia a text. It was the first time they had communicated in over 2 weeks. The message was short. "Can we talk? Just you and me. Tonight." Georgia stared at that message for a long time. Part of her didn't want to go. Part of her was terrified. But another part of her, the part that still cared about Naomi, still felt the weight of what she had done, couldn't say no. She texted back. "Okay, what time?" Naomi replied. "Come to the house, 7 o'clock, alone." Georgia arrived at 6:55. The porch light was on. The street was quiet. She knocked on the door, and Naomi answered. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She didn't smile. She just stepped aside and let Georgia in. They sat down at the kitchen table. Naomi poured 2 glasses of wine. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi said, "I just need to understand. Why? Why would you do this to me?" Georgia's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt you, I swear. I felt so alone, Naomi. And he made me feel like I mattered." Naomi shook her head. "You mattered to me. I was your friend." "I know," Georgia whispered. "And I ruined it. I ruined everything." They talked for over an hour. Sometimes it was calm. Sometimes voices were raised. At one point, Naomi broke down crying, and Georgia reached across the table to take her hand. Naomi pulled away. Then, just after 9 o'clock, neighbors heard shouting. A loud crash, and then silence. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. At 9:47 p.m., a neighbor called the police. She told the dispatcher she heard screaming coming from the right house, followed by what sounded like something heavy hitting the floor. Officers arrived within minutes. The front door was unlocked. They walked inside, calling out, but no one answered. In the kitchen, they found Naomi Wright lying on the floor in a pool of blood. She had suffered severe trauma to the back of her head. A wine bottle lay shattered nearby. There was no pulse. Naomi was gone. Georgia was found sitting on the back porch, her hands covered in blood, her face blank with shock. When officers approached her, she looked up and said, "I didn't mean to. I swear to God, I didn't mean to." She was immediately taken into custody. At the station, Georgia gave a statement. She said that she and Naomi had been talking, that things got heated, that Naomi stood up and started yelling. Georgia said she tried to leave, but Naomi blocked the door. They struggled. Naomi shoved her. Georgia grabbed the wine bottle off the counter to defend herself. And then, in a moment of panic and rage, she swung. She said she didn't remember how many times. She just remembered Naomi falling. And then the silence. But as investigators processed the scene, they found something that didn't quite fit Georgia's story. There was a third wine glass on the counter. Fingerprints were lifted from the glass, the door handle, and the edge of the kitchen table. They belonged to Gideon Wright. Detectives issued an immediate search for Gideon. His truck was found 2 days later, abandoned near a bridge about 30 miles outside of town. There were no signs of a struggle, no suicide note, just an empty vehicle with the keys still in the ignition. A massive search was launched. Volunteers combed the riverbanks. Divers checked the water below the bridge. But there was no body, no trace of Gideon Wright. Back at the station, investigators began piecing together what had really happened that night. Phone records showed that Gideon had texted Georgia hours before the confrontation. The message read, "Don't go over there tonight. Please, it's not safe." Georgia never responded. Detectives also discovered that Naomi had changed the beneficiary on her life insurance policy 3 weeks before her death. She had removed Gideon's name and replaced it with her sister's. It was a small detail, but it suggested that Naomi had been preparing to leave him, to cut ties completely. When they re-interviewed Georgia, she admitted that Gideon had been there that night. She said he showed up about 20 minutes after she arrived. He came to try to stop the confrontation, to calm things down, but Naomi turned on him. She screamed at him, told him to get out, told him she never wanted to see him again. Georgia said that Gideon tried to step between them when things got physical. That's when Naomi grabbed a kitchen knife. Gideon wrestled it away from her, cutting his hand in the process. Blood was found on the knife handle that matched Gideon's DNA. Georgia said that in the chaos, she grabbed the wine bottle and struck Naomi. Once, maybe twice. She said she was trying to protect Gideon, trying to stop Naomi from hurting him. But when Naomi fell and didn't get up, Gideon panicked. He told Georgia to stay there, to call the police, to tell them the truth. And then he left. Just walked out the back door and disappeared into the night. Weeks passed with no sign of Gideon. Some believed he had taken his own life out of guilt. Others thought he had fled the state, maybe even the country. The case became a media sensation. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Headlines read, "Trans woman accused of killing best friend in love triangle gone wrong." The coverage was brutal. Commentators debated Georgia's identity, her morality, her right to exist in a small conservative town. Some painted her as a victim of circumstance. Others called her a predator, a homewrecker, a murderer. The town of Fairmont, Ohio, was deeply divided. Half the community showed up to Naomi's funeral, mourning the loss of a beloved teacher and friend. The other half whispered about how she should have seen it coming, how she never should have trusted Georgia in the first place. Meanwhile, Georgia sat in a county jail cell, awaiting trial. She wrote letters to Gideon that were never sent. She wrote letters to Naomi's family, begging for forgiveness. None of them were answered. 3 months after Naomi's death, Gideon Wright turned himself in. He walked into a police station in Kentucky, told them who he was, and said he was ready to tell the truth. In his statement, Gideon said that he had gone to the house that night because he was afraid. He knew Naomi was angry, unstable, and he didn't trust what she might do to Georgia. When he arrived, the argument was already escalating. He said Naomi confronted him with the knife, accused him of choosing Georgia over her, over their marriage, over everything they had built together. He said he tried to calm her down, but she lunged at him. He grabbed her wrist, twisted the knife away, and that's when Georgia stepped in. Gideon claimed that Georgia didn't mean to kill Naomi. He said it was self-defense, that Naomi had become violent and unpredictable, but he also admitted that after Naomi fell, he froze. He didn't call for help. He didn't try to save her. He just ran. He said the guilt had been eating him alive ever since, that he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't live with himself. So he came back to face the consequences. Georgia's trial began in the summer of 2020. The prosecution argued that Georgia had struck Naomi multiple times with the wine bottle in a fit of rage, that it was not self-defense but an act of passion fueled by jealousy and guilt. The defense painted a different picture. They argued that Naomi had been the aggressor, that Georgia had been defending herself and Gideon, and that the tragedy was the result of a toxic, emotionally charged situation that spiraled out of control. Character witnesses were called. Naomi's family spoke about the kind, loving woman she had been. Georgia's former co-workers testified about the harassment she had endured in the weeks leading up to the incident. Gideon took the stand. He was visibly broken, his voice shaking as he recounted the events of that night. He said, "I loved them both, and I destroyed them both." The jury deliberated for 4 days. In the end, they found Georgia Turner guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not premeditated murder. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison. Gideon Wright was charged with obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. He received a sentence of 3 years. Naomi's family was devastated by the outcome. Her sister stood outside the courthouse and said, "Justice was not served today. My sister is gone, and the people responsible get to walk out of prison someday. That's not justice." But others in the community felt differently. Some believed that Georgia had been a victim too, caught in an impossible situation, punished not just for her actions, but for who she was. The case sparked debates about identity, morality, justice, and compassion that would echo far beyond the borders of that small Ohio town. Georgia is currently serving her sentence at a women's correctional facility in Ohio. In a rare prison interview conducted 2 years after her conviction, she spoke about the night that changed everything. "I think about Naomi every single day," she said. "I see her face, I hear her voice, and I know that no amount of time, no amount of punishment will ever bring her back. I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted to be loved. I wanted to belong, and I made choices that cost someone their life. I have to live with that forever." She also spoke about Gideon. "I don't blame him for leaving. I understand why he ran. We were both scared, we were both broken, and we both made terrible mistakes. I hope he finds peace someday. I really do." Gideon was released from prison after serving 2 years. He moved out of state and has not spoken publicly about the case since his release. Naomi's family remains torn. Some have forgiven Georgia, believing that the situation was more complicated than the headlines suggested. Others refuse to speak her name, unable to reconcile the loss of someone they loved with the circumstances that led to her death. The town of Fairmont has slowly moved on, but the memory of what happened lingers. Naomi's classroom at the elementary school was turned into a reading library in her honor. A small memorial was placed in the town square with her name etched into stone. And every year on the anniversary of her death, former students and community members gather to remember the woman who stood up for others, who believed in kindness, and who lost her life in a tragedy no one could have predicted. In the end, 3 lives were shattered by love, lies, and choices that couldn't be undone. Some say it was passion, others call it tragedy. But in small-town Ohio, the scars remain. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the complexity of relationships, and about how quickly things can fall apart when emotions run too deep and boundaries are broken. Naomi wanted to help someone who felt invisible. Gideon wanted to feel understood. Georgia wanted to belong. And all 3 paid a price far greater than any of them could have imagined. So we ask you, what do you think really happened that night? Was Georgia a victim of her own heart, caught in a moment of panic and fear? Or was there something more calculated, something darker at play? How would you feel if you were in Naomi's position, betrayed by the 2 people you trusted most? Or if you were Georgia, desperate for connection and acceptance, only to lose everything in a single moment? And what about Gideon, the man who walked away? Does his guilt make him just as responsible? Or was he simply a broken person trying to survive? These are not easy questions, and maybe there are no easy answers, but that's what makes this story so haunting. It reminds us that real life is messy, that people are complicated, and that love in all its forms can heal us or destroy us. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you feel something deep, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more stories like this to people who need to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another video. Thank you for watching. And remember, every story we tell is a reminder that behind every headline, there are real people, real pain, and real consequences. Stay safe, stay compassionate, and we'll see you in the next one.